Have you ever flipped on a cartoon expecting lighthearted fun, only to wonder if your TV had turned into a swirling lava lamp? The 1970s were a wild ride for animation, where logic took a back seat to neon chaos and dreamlike experiments. Heroes went cosmic bands floated through galaxies, and familiar characters ended up in worlds that bent reality. These weren't just shows, they were trippy adventures kids never forgot. Star Trek, the animated series, 1973 to 1974. What happens when you take a serious sci-fi franchise and funnel it through Saturday morning animation? You get Star Trek, the animated series, a cartoon that was equal parts adventure and psychedelic daydream. On the surface, it was meant to continue the voyages of the USS Enterprise after the live-action series ended, but the budget limitations and Filmation's signature style made it unlike anything Trekkies expected. Backgrounds weren't just star fields. They swirled with unreal colors, purples, greens, and oranges that looked more like paint poured into water than outer space. Alien worlds shifted between crystalline deserts, glowing forests, and cities that bent gravity itself. Characters moved stiffly, almost hypnotically, and the aliens freed from live-action constraints were dreamlike in design. 3 armed crew members, talking cat people, and massive floating heads weren't just possible, they were routine. Even the music underscored the surreal tone, with eerie echoing cues that made you feel like you were adrift in an endless cosmos. For kids tuning in, it didn't always make sense. One minute Kirk was debating morality with a glowing entity. The next Spock was face-to-face with an alternate version of himself as a child. The pace was slow, the atmosphere heavy, and the visuals so trippy that you could almost forget it was supposed to be for kids. Yet that weirdness is exactly why it became legendary. It was the only cartoon to win Star Trek an Emmy, and for young viewers, it cemented the idea that animation could deliver cosmic philosophy, not just pratfalls. Star Trek. The animated series wasn't just another spin-off. It was a glowing kaleidoscopic time capsule of the decade's boldest experiments. Josie and the Pussycats in Outer Space, 1972 to 1973. How do you make a bubblegum rock band even weirder? Launch them into space. That's exactly what Hanna-Barbera did with Josie and the Pussycats in Outer Space. Originally, Josie and her bandmates were just fashionable teenagers solving groovy mysteries on Earth. But for the sequel series, the gang's plane accidentally launched into orbit, and suddenly they were cosmic explorers. Right away, the tone shifted from campy fun to full psychedelic overload. Each week, Josie, Valerie, Melody, and their friends stumbled onto alien planets drenched in neon colors. One episode found them dodging giant crystal creatures on a glowing desert world. Another had them battling hypnotic beings that multiplied in rainbow flashes. The animation embraced impossible geometries, spirals that never-ended, caves that twisted in on themselves, and skies that pulse like a lava lamp come alive. The show also leaned heavily on musical interludes. Picture Josie strumming her guitar while galaxies spun in the background, stars exploding to the rhythm. The music wasn't just a soundtrack. It was the show's engine, carrying the gang from one bizarre set piece to another. For kids expecting another Scooby-Doo clone, it was overwhelming. Instead of haunted mansions, they got planetary dreamscapes. Instead of unmasking villains, they drifted through surreal cosmic morality tales. Adults brushed it off as harmless fluff, but to young viewers it was one of the trippiest blends of pop culture and sci-fi ever beamed into living rooms. Josie and the Pussycats in Outer Space proved that you could mix guitars, glitter, and galaxies into one kaleidoscopic package. It didn't last long, but it left an unforgettable mark. Seab 2020, 1972. Imagine Scooby-Doo underwater, but without the jokes and way more eerie. That's Seab 2020, a short-lived but unforgettable Hanna-Barbera experiment that stranded kids in a psychedelic version of the deep sea. Set in a futuristic research facility under the ocean, the show aimed to teach ecological lessons. But what it delivered was equal parts science fiction and hypnotic dreamscape. The ocean itself became a psychedelic backdrop. Schools of glowing fish darted across swirls of blue and green, giant octopuses loomed in shifting shadows, and mysterious sea plants waved like they were alive. Every episode dropped the crew of Seab into strange crises, alien-looking sea creatures, undersea earthquakes, or bizarre technology gone haywire. The slow, deliberate pace combined with the ocean's surreal design made it feel like a fever dream instead of straightforward entertainment. The characters themselves often looked dwarfed by the endless swirling deep. Kids expected action, but what they got was quiet tension, crew members floating through haunting caverns, while eerie sound effects echoed in the background. Even the voices seemed to drift, as though carried by underwater currents. It was intended to be educational, but its hypnotic visuals made it feel like something more experimental. Children who tuned in likely remembered less about recycling and more about glowing jellyfish that stretched across the screen like alien invaders. Seab 2020 only lasted 13 episodes, but the imagery lingered. Decades later, it even inspired the satirical Adult Swim parody Seab 2021, proving its strange legacy. For 70s, Kids Seab wasn't just a cartoon. It was a slow-moving psychedelic dive into the unknown. Freedom Force, 1978. What happens when mythology superheroes and trippy visuals collide? You get Freedom Force, one of Filmation's strangest late 70s creations. The premise alone was wild. A team of heroes pulled from legend and myth: Hercules, Sinbad, Merlin, a Native American superhero called Super Samurai, and even ISIS banding together to fight cosmic threats. That sounds straightforward, but the execution was anything but. Each episode hurled the team into abstract battles where landscapes bent logic. One moment they were soaring through neon vortexes, the next they were fighting shadowy figures inside crystalline castles that seemed alive. The animation leaned hard into psychedelic excess. Backgrounds swirled like painted glass beams of light, pulsed across the screen, and magical powers manifested as shifting kaleidoscope bursts. What really set it apart was the pacing. Unlike many action cartoons, Freedom Force often paused mid-battle for speeches about honor destiny or cosmic balance. For kids, that meant sudden switches between dazzling visuals and heavy, almost philosophical monologues. The music only heightened the effect, echoing horns, droning strings, and futuristic flourishes that made everything feel larger than life. It didn't last long, only a handful of episodes, but it stuck in viewers' heads. Seeing mythological icons interact inside such surreal environments was unlike anything else on Saturday mornings. Some children loved the spectacle, others found it baffling, but nobody forgot it. Freedom Force was less a superhero show and more a kaleidoscopic stage play about destiny. Too weird for most kids? Absolutely. Too daring to ignore? Without a doubt. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kids, 1973. Take a bubblegum pop band, add secret agent missions, and wrap it all in psychedelic visuals. That's Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kids, produced by Hanna-Barbera. This short-lived series followed a group of teenagers in a band who moonlighted as spies for a mysterious government organization. Yes, really. One moment they were playing a concert, the next they were piloting rainbow-colored hovercrafts or chasing villains across dreamlike landscapes. The visuals leaned heavily into psychedelic territory. Backgrounds shifted from swirling cityscapes to glowing secret lairs. Chase sequences were drenched in impossible colors and looping animations that looked more like abstract art than coherent plots. Every mission felt less about the mystery and more about the ride through a neon-soaked dream. And then there were the music numbers. Each episode featured the band performing complete with kaleidoscopic backdrops. Instruments stretched, multiplied, and seemed to float off the screen, while characters danced in impossible patterns. It was like watching a lava lamp sing in harmony. The spy plots themselves often made little sense. Gadgets appeared out of nowhere, villains melted into shadows, and problems got solved with abrupt bursts of music. Kids might have come for the catchy songs, but what they got was pure psychedelic chaos. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kids only ran for 13 episodes, yet it left a permanent impression. It was part spy spoof, part music video, part neon fever dream. For young audiences in the 1970s, it was one of the strangest adventures ever packaged as Saturday morning fun. The Brady Kids, 1972 to 1974. What happens when a live-action family sitcom decides to leap into cartoon form? You get the Brady Kids, a spin-off so surreal, it made the original Brady Bunch look downright normal. The setup was simple enough. The 6 Brady children, now animated, went on adventures with their pets. But instead of relatable backyard antics, the cartoon launched them into psychedelic chaos. Magical birds that could talk? Check. A pair of pandas that behaved more like mischievous genies than animals? Also check. The strangest part was how often reality unraveled. One moment, the Brady kids were dealing with schoolyard problems. The next, they were transported into fantasy lands where colors pulsed, landscapes bent like melting wax, and logic vanished altogether. The show loved dream sequences, dropping the kids into swirling rainbow backdrops where solutions appeared out of thin air. And then there was the music. Of course the Brady kids sang, but these weren't simple performances. The cartoon staged them inside neon-colored musical montages with instruments, glowing voices echoing into cosmic voids, and visuals that felt more like a trip through a kaleidoscope than a concert. For children expecting more wholesome fun from their TV siblings, the show was bewildering. Parents thought it was harmless filler, but kids couldn't shake the feeling that something about those pandas and glowing birds was just a little too strange. The Brady Kids only ran for a short time, but its blend of pop culture magic and psychedelic visuals made it unforgettable. It wasn't just a cartoon about siblings, it was a Saturday morning fever dream. Wheelie and the Chopper Bunch, 1974 to 1975. How do you make cars more than just cars? Give them personalities, neon colors, and surreal adventures. That was the premise behind Wheelie and the Chopper Bunch, one of Hanna-Barbera's most unusual attempts at mixing machines and mayhem. The star was Wheelie, a red Volkswagen Beetle, with eyes and a voice always chased by a gang of talking motorcycles known as the Chopper Bunch. What could have been simple slapstick racing turned into something much stranger. The chases were psychedelic spectacles. Backgrounds looped endlessly, roads twisted into spirals, and color palettes shifted mid-scene like someone was shaking a lava lamp. Instead of normal slapstick gags, cars stretched, squashed, and even floated in impossible ways. One episode might feature the Chopper Bunch multiplying into rainbow-colored doubles. Another might see Wheelie escaping through a portal of glowing light. The sound design made it even stranger. Engines didn't just roar, they laughed, whined, and sang in mechanical voices. Music would suddenly burst into a scene, turning a simple race into a neon-colored musical interlude. Kids tuned in for car chases, but ended up watching a mechanical dreamscape. It only lasted one season, but the sheer weirdness burned itself into memory. Wheelie and the Chopper Bunch wasn't about logic. It was about turning Saturday morning into a surreal racing loop where anything could happen. The Space Sentinels, 1977. Superheroes were everywhere in the 70s, but few looked as trippy as the Space Sentinels. The show introduced three young heroes chosen by aliens to protect Earth: Hercules, Mercury, and Estrella. Already you had a mix of mythology and science fiction. But Filmation took it further, loading the series with psychedelic backdrops that made every episode feel like a glowing mural. Estrella could transform into animals, and those sequences alone were mind-bending. Picture a woman morphing into a neon eagle, mid-flight feathers flashing in rainbow streaks. Hercules lifted mountains against skies that pulsed in bright purples and blues. Mercury zipped through streaks of glowing light that made him look less like a runner and more like a comet. The villains matched the weirdness. Shadow creatures, glowing robots, and godlike beings filled the screen, each surrounded by shifting dreamlike visuals. The show's sound design added to the surreal mood with echoing effects that made everything feel otherworldly. Kids expecting straightforward superhero brawls got instead a mixture of cosmic philosophy and psychedelic transformations. For adults, it might have looked silly, but for children, the visuals were unforgettable. The Space Sentinels lasted only one season, but it carved out a reputation as one of Filmation's strangest works. It wasn't just another superhero show, it was a Saturday morning vision quest. Clue Club, 1976 to 1979. At first glance, Clue Club looked like another Scooby-Doo clone. But pay attention, and it was a stranger, trippier ride. The premise: 4 teenage detectives solving mysteries with the help of 2 talking bloodhounds. So far, so familiar. But where Scooby stuck to spooky mansions and unmasking villains, Clue Club leaned into surreal psychedelic flourishes. Whenever the kids pieced together a mystery, the visuals warped. Flashbacks unfolded in kaleidoscopic montages, suspects appeared against swirling color backdrops, and chase scenes looped with dizzying repetition. Even dialogue sometimes faded into abstract dream sequences, leaving kids wondering whether they were watching a mystery or slipping into a daydream. The dog's woofer and whimper added to the chaos. Their antics often turned into surreal slapstick stretching across impossible backgrounds or popping in and out of reality like cartoons caught mid-glitch. The animation style was rough, almost exaggerated, which only added to the psychedelic vibe. Instead of crisp outlines, characters sometimes blurred against neon. Patterns. The effect made it feel less like a polished mystery and more like a visual experiment. Clue Club ran for several years, but it never shook its reputation as the weird cousin of Scooby-Doo. It wasn't just a mystery-solving cartoon, it was a trippy detour into neon dream logic. Yogi's Space Race, 1978 to 1979. What happens when a beloved bear ditches the picnic basket and blasts into outer space? You get Yogi's Space Race, one of the wildest Hanna-Barbera experiments of the decade. The premise mashed up Yogi Bear, Huckleberry Hound, and other familiar faces with a cosmic racing league. But this wasn't just any race. It was a kaleidoscopic neon-colored spectacle that felt more like a dream than a competition. Each episode had the characters piloting bizarre shape-shifting vehicles through glowing planets and psychedelic star fields. One track might feature rainbow rings floating in space, another would spiral down a vortex of flashing lights. The races often abandoned logic altogether, with shortcuts opening into swirling portals and obstacles melting into surreal shapes. Even the characters themselves shifted into weirder versions. Yogi was suddenly a cosmic racer, complete with futuristic gear. New characters appeared like Scare Bear, who looked like he'd walk straight out of a neon fever dream. The pacing was fast, the visuals dazzling, and the humor chaotic. For kids, it was a sensory overload. For parents, it was baffling. Why was a cartoon bear suddenly flying a rocket car through a Technicolor galaxy? Yogi's Space Race only lasted one season, but it stood out as one of Hanna-Barbera's boldest experiments. It proved that even the most familiar characters could be tossed into psychedelic chaos. Valley of the Dinosaurs, 1974 to 1975. Time travel plus prehistory plus psychedelic visuals. Valley of the Dinosaurs delivered it all. The premise saw a modern family hurled back into the Stone Age during a rafting accident. They ended up living alongside a prehistoric tribe in a world filled with dinosaurs, strange plants, and surreal landscapes. On the surface, it sounded like straightforward adventure, but the visuals told a different story. The jungle wasn't just green, it was alive with exaggerated colors, glowing rivers, and skies that pulsed in hues of purple and orange. Dinosaurs didn't just lumber around. They towered like hallucinations, stretching across the screen in exaggerated proportions. The landscapes twisted in ways that felt more dreamlike than natural, as if the entire valley existed inside a shifting painting. Episodes often swung between survival lessons, how to build fire, how to find food, and sudden bursts of psychedelic imagery. A chase through a canyon might transform into a montage of flashing lights and endless loops. A family discussion around the fire could suddenly dissolve into neon-hued dream sequences. For kids, it was confusing but captivating. One moment they were learning prehistoric survival skills. The next they were staring at an endless swirl of neon-colored skies. Parents might have praised the educational angle, but children knew they were watching something far stranger. Valley of the Dinosaurs lasted only one season, but its blend of prehistoric adventure and psychedelic visuals kept it memorable. It was less about science and more about the surreal power of imagination. Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle, 1976 to 1980. Tarzan may be a classic character, but in the 70s, his cartoon became something truly psychedelic. Filmation's Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle aimed to bring the famous hero to Saturday mornings. Instead of simple jungle adventures, viewers were pulled into lush, glowing landscapes and surreal encounters that transformed the series into something stranger than expected. The jungle itself looked otherworldly. Trees pulsed with neon colors, rivers shimmered in rainbow hues, and creatures appeared with exaggerated dreamlike features. Tarzan didn't just swing on vines. He soared through swirling backdrops that bent reality into dazzling murals. Episodes often leaned into mythology. One week, Tarzan battled strange gods in glowing temples. Another, he traveled into hidden cities lit by shifting colors. The blend of African wilderness fantasy and neon-colored visuals made the show feel like a fever dream. Even Tarzan's iconic yell was paired with psychedelic sound design, echoing against surreal skies until it became more mystical chant than jungle call. The stories mixed morality tales with mythic grandeur, but for kids the real takeaway was the hypnotic visuals. Tarzan Lord of the Jungle ran for several years, but it never escaped its reputation as one of the most visually surreal cartoons of its time. It wasn't just about a man in the jungle. It was about plunging into a neon-colored wilderness where anything could happen. The New Adventures of Gilligan, 1974 to 1977. What happens when a goofy castaway show turns into a cartoon? It gets way weirder than anyone expected. The New Adventures of Gilligan brought the beloved sitcom characters back, but instead of laugh-track antics, kids were treated to surreal Saturday morning chaos. Gilligan the skipper and the gang were stranded once again on their tropical island, only this time the island looked less like a beach and more like a psychedelic dreamscape. The skies shimmered in neon hues, animals spoke in exaggerated tones, and nature itself seemed to bend around Gilligan's bumbling. Palm trees stretched like rubber caves glowed with impossible colors, and sudden dream sequences often dropped characters into kaleidoscopic backdrops that had little to do with the main story. It felt less like survival comedy and more like drifting through a tropical hallucination. Adding to the strangeness was Snubby the monkey, a new character who constantly pulled the group into even stranger predicaments. His antics often dissolved into slapstick chaos, paired with swirling backgrounds and zany sound effects, making the whole show feel like a fever dream. And of course, there were lessons. Each episode tried to sneak in a moral about teamwork or honesty, but the surreal presentation usually overshadowed the message. Kids remembered the neon animals and the dizzying montages more than the advice. The New Adventures of Gilligan ran for a few years, and while it never reached the iconic status of the live-action sitcom, it carved its own bizarre niche. It wasn't just a cartoon remake, it was a Technicolor island trip too weird for words. Dynomutt Dog Wonder, 1976 to 1977. What do you get when you mix Batman-style crime, fighting with a robotic dog who falls apart in neon-colored chaos? Dynomutt Dog Wonder. This Hanna-Barbera series paired the serious Blue Falcon with his clumsy sidekick, Dynomutt, a robotic canine whose gadgets constantly malfunctioned. While the comedy was obvious, the visuals were surprisingly psychedelic. Whenever Dynomutt's gadgets activated, the screen filled with flashing lights, twisting shapes, and surreal transformations. His body stretched, bent, and morphed into absurd forms, often glowing against pulsing backgrounds. What should have been slapstick humor often looked like a mechanical hallucination. The villains added to the spectacle. Instead of ordinary crooks, the Falcon and Dynomutt faced colorful, surreal antagonists characters in costumes so bizarre they looked ripped from dream journals. Each layer or setting leaned into neon exaggeration. Floating castles warped cityscapes or laboratories filled with impossible machines. Kids tuned in for laughs, but found themselves staring at sequences that looked less like action and more like visual experiments. The mix of superhero parody and psychedelic visuals was unlike anything else on TV at the time. Dynomutt Dog Wonder didn't run for long, but it stood out. It wasn't just about a robotic dog bungling through crime fighting, it was a glowing fever dream disguised as slapstick. Galaxy Goofups, 1978 to 1979. What if you took disco outer space and classic cartoon characters and shook them inside a kaleidoscope? That was Galaxy Goofups, a spin-off of Yogi's Space Race. The show followed Yogi Bear and his friends as bumbling intergalactic police officers. But instead of straightforward missions, viewers got neon-colored chaos mixed with heavy doses of disco culture. Episodes swung wildly between outer space slapstick and dance sequences that felt like animated nightclubs. Picture Yogi and Huckleberry Hound busting moves under pulsing rainbow lights while planets floated in the background. The blend of space and disco made it less about storytelling and more about constant sensory overload. The space settings were pure psychedelic invention. One week, the characters flew through glowing asteroid belts shaped like instruments. Another, they danced their way out of trouble inside a neon-colored wormhole. The animation leaned hard into bright colors, exaggerated designs, and surreal cutaways. For kids, it was baffling. Were they supposed to laugh, dance, or just sit back and stare at the colors? Parents shrugged it off as harmless fun, but children couldn't forget the surreal mix of disco rhythms and cosmic slapstick. Galaxy Goofups only lasted one season, but it perfectly captured the decade's experimental spirit. It wasn't just another cartoon, it was a Saturday morning disco in space. And there you have it, 15 more psychedelic cartoons from the 1970s that turned Saturday mornings into neon fever dreams. Some dazzled, some confused, but all left their mark. Which of these do you remember, and which blew your mind the most? Share your thoughts, hit that subscribe button, and pass this along to a fellow animation fan. Because the weirdest corners of pop culture are always worth revisiting.